and they can. You have received the outline for the lecture today. So everyone's on the group except Amita ma'am. You can put her on also, please. All right. So I don't need to keep sending individual emails to you, and to Harsh. Okay. So before I start today, I just wanted to, and I'll send you an email to this effect also. Tomorrow there is a panel discussion on consent, and I thought that that's like appropriate for us to attend, and that's why we'll make instead of coming to class, we'll go there, and that will be treated as you're attending the session. And after tomorrow, we have 3 more sessions, and what I'm thinking is that 2-hour sessions will probably do us rather than 3-hour sessions. And at the end, I will also ask you, how did you cope with the 3 hours in a class? Like, it is very long, and you kind of start losing concentration, which is human. So we'll do that for the last 3 sessions, because after this, basically, it is a illustration of the argument that I have been building up till now. The other thing that I wanted to say was that for the last thing I want to do with you is talk about the assignment, the assessment task. And I have said in the write-up for the program that everyone can choose their own topic. But I'm kind of thinking about it that you guys seem too pressed for time and may not want to think of a topic. So is it all right for me to suggest a topic? And if you want, we can have a discussion on how to approach it. Even 10 minutes of that discussion would probably be enough. So we can either do it on Thursday or Friday. And I'll give you a set topic, but if anyone feels strongly that they want to write their own, that's possible. So you just have to tell me that you want to do that. Okay. All right. So in today's lecture, I'm going to talk about gender and or call it feminism and gender, or gender and feminism, etc. And the outline basically is giving you the main idea is that gender blind approach of the law is a cover for the male oriented and discriminatory legal knowledge and policy. So what I'm getting at is that we are approaching this topic with this main idea in mind. Now, this idea is invoking the mainstream understanding of law as proper law, appropriate law has to be gender neutral. So what the feminist critique of that position is to say that gender blind approach, you understand what I mean by gender blind approach. So basically the law takes no account of gender. It is saying taking account of gender is a problem, and feminists are saying that gender blind approach is a cover for how legal knowledge is not neutral knowledge. So the first topic is, what does it mean to say that jurisprudence and law are gendered? So this is the feminist argument that I'm putting forward, that a lot of feminists will put forward this general proposition, which they will elaborate, that both jurisprudence and law are gendered. When I say jurisprudence, it basically means legal theory. Okay, so what is meant in the literature that jurisprudence and law are gendered is that law and legal theory, so there's a few propositions. So at one level, feminism stands for this, but since we are studying it, we have to have a fairly detailed understanding of what is meant. So the propositions that are covered under this general statement are that law and legal theory are the province of men. That is, who is doing legal theory and who are the people who are basically dealing with law are mostly men, but they claim that personal history does not influence the author's views. Okay, so by this time you should be making connections with what has gone before. So we have been critiquing the idea of objective knowledge, So this is an illustration of that, that what the feminist critique is saying, that what you call objective knowledge is actually gendered experiences of men, but they go in the name of objective knowledge. Secondly, value systems of law and culture are masculine. That is, the kinds of values that the legal system promotes. So what are the kinds of values that our legal system promotes, our law promotes? Law has to be rational, law has to be objective, it has to be neutral, and the whole list goes on. And the critique from feminists is that these are masculine value systems. Now, what does it mean to say that they are masculine value systems? Is not that men think like that and women think like that, but a distinction is being made between masculinity and femininity as constructs, as ideas. So so make a distinction that it is not being said that all men are supposed to be that. No, that's not what is being said. It is being said that law subscribes to these values as preferable values, and the consequence of that preference is that legal ideas are basically resonating with the lived experiences of men more than of women. And it's not the same as saying all men think like that and all women think like that. Third point is that substantive legal categories overlook, trivialize or marginalize the concerns of women. So substantive legal categories means what? When you're talking about law in any given area, you're talking with certain legal categories like public and private, or contract and something else, or so those kinds of categories, the argument is, are not reflecting, are not resonating with women's experiences. But not only that, women's experiences are then trivialized. One common example here is that law is supposed to be rational, or you have the reasonable man of law. What does that mean? So not only that every legal subject should act like that, somebody who doesn't act like that then is doing less than what they are supposed to be behaving as. And very often the argument in the literature is that women are emotional, or this witness is not a trustworthy witness because they are too emotional, or their response is anger rather than rational, etc. So not only that you're not reflecting how a very large number of women, if not all women, would behave, you are also saying that that is not the right way to behave. And abstract theory denies the relevance of experience in construction of knowledge. That is, we have been talking about it. Your legal person is supposed to be a person who does not have a specific context. So we are not really interested in knowing, as lawyers, as legal thinkers, whether you are a man or a woman, what's your sexuality, what's your ability, etc., because those are considered to be irrelevant detail about you. So how are you treated by law? You're treated as an abstract legal person who doesn't, or we are not worried about what your social position is, what your economic position is, etc. And by doing that, you're making it harder for you to be able to argue that maybe your experience and my experience are different, and the law should take that into account. How does the law make it irrelevant? Is by saying that theory has to be abstract theory. Okay. The second point is theory practice divide. We have come across it right at the beginning of the unit, that basically do lawyers need to know legal theory, or knowing the detail of substantive law is enough for us to be able to practice. The same is manifested in feminist literature, legal feminist literature, saying feminism is really about real problems of women. As legal feminists, if we start dabbling in theory, we're basically making legal feminism irrelevant to most women. So do feminists really need to deal with theory? I'll come to that in during the lecture. The third point is that when we're talking about feminism and the law, what does feminism mean? And the term there is feminisms. So there is no one body of knowledge that is feminism. There are different perspectives, and why should we take those into account and what are the consequences? We'll talk about that. And the fourth is, what's the point of all this activity? Like if feminists are saying that mainstream legal theory and substantive law is masculine, then what do they want? Do they want feminine law? If you did manage to tell me what feminine law is that what the aim is? So the argument is no, the aim is not that you replace one perspective by another, but to acknowledge that more than one perspective is always the case. So it's not like it is a peculiar problem of women that they have a perspective. The argument is that all knowledge is coming from certain perspectives, and we have to start acknowledging those perspectives. It doesn't mean that everything goes or anything goes, but what it means is that when I put forward my particular understanding, at least I am seeking your acceptance that see my point of view. While mainstream legal theory and mainstream theory in every discipline is basically saying this is the truth of the matter, accept it and carry on. So this is the central message that Davis is pursuing in the book, basically saying that the object of the exercise or the aim of the exercise is to shake our notion that objective knowledge or the final truth of any area of knowledge and particularly of legal knowledge is possible. So if it is not possible, what is the alternative? This is what is happening from today onwards, that feminists are saying these are the things that need to happen. Then postmodernists are saying this is what needs to happen, and we'll go on in that way, that different sections of society are saying this is what is missing from your way of doing theory. All right, starting then with why do we need to take feminist points of view into account with regard to legal theory is that the question that feminists are asking that mainstream theory doesn't ask is neutral or objective way of seeing things possible? Why are they asking this is because when feminists make an argument that women's experiences are not represented in legal theory, the counter argument from the dominant ways of doing theory is that you are biased, that you only want to talk about women, but we are really in the business of talking about everyone. So wouldn't that be a fair enough comment? Should the law be gender neutral or should the law be gender specific? As lawyers, you must have come across this question, or have you? Have you at all? Yes? Where, in which area of law? Can you give me, can you think of an example? I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to get you to contextualize what I'm saying. So should the same legal rights apply to men and women, or should women be able to claim a separate set of rights because of being women?
Applying for maternity leave or having maternity benefits, etc. If you put in a gender neutral law there, you're specifically discriminating against women whose and pregnancies is seen as a function of you being a woman. So in certain cases, yes, gender specific law is necessary, but maybe not in all spheres.
All right. We had a little bit of this discussion before. So the capacity to gestate is a specifically female capacity, and we acknowledge that. All right. Gestation only requires maximum 9 months. Okay. We acknowledge that we'll let you have that different right. Anything else can you think of? I'm not saying that finishes the discussion, but I'm saying let's leave that aside for the time being. It's such an obvious thing. Like, how are you going to argue against that position?
Yeah, so provisions with regard to dowry and dowry death in IPC, I mean, that could be one where you are specifically legislating, keeping in mind the social practices where women are discriminated because of some social practices prevailing in the society.
All right. I'm not sure that I get that point, because the law against dowry is basically saying that taking or giving dowry is bad. Is it specifically kind of a benefit that is, or an recognition of a special need that women have been given? Yeah.
It's just like what I see is there's no benefit to women as such. It's just like consequences, just to avoid the consequence of that particular.
Okay. And the
problem.
consequences happen to women that are more damaging. Is that the argument? All right. Yeah. What I'm trying to get at is that you think of an example where, okay, let me go back a step. Historically, what has happened in law is basically women were denied certain rights on the basis that they were women. So, have you heard of Married Women's Right to Property Acts? You have at least heard about it? What was that about? Does anyone remember vaguely? Okay. Basically, the common law principle was, and we being a British colony, British laws applied, which we live by even now.
Basically, they weren't entitled to the property as much as their brothers were after marriage.
Yes, that's true, but even more in legal language, their right to hold property, they did not have the capacity to be owners of property after marriage. Do you get the point that there was a legal disability applying to women after marriage, in that the marriage meant the man and woman were a union, and women were then not entitled, legally not entitled to hold property, because their status as a legal woman, as a married woman, meant that they did not have that legal capacity. So you can think of many such examples where women were denied rights for no other reason except that the fact of being woman. Now, law reforms. Damages.
The damages which have to come in, because you sort of make it like housework is not work, hence the value of a woman's life becomes a lot lower than what you would see as the value of, say, a man's life.
All right. That's a very good example, but I want to save it for a bit later, because what I'm trying to say is that there was blatant legal provisions, specific statutory provisions, if you like, saying that you are
disqualified, which disqualified.
Yeah, so which basically gave lesser rights to women because of the fact of being women. Yeah. Another example is that after marriage, the woman did not have the capacity, the married woman does not have the capacity to enter into a contract because her legal personality merged into that of the husband. Now, these kinds of discriminatory laws have been abolished more or less. Leave the family law aside, everywhere else, more or less have been abolished. Now, the point that is being, legal feminists are raising is that there is one kind of reform where women are made equal to men. Surely that's a good thing. What about the fact that women are being treated like men? In other words, equality means that women can have what men already have. So the point being that what about with regard to pregnancy, that if women need maternity leave in the sense that to give birth, if not to look after the infant for the next 6 months or whatever, is that a special treatment or is it equality? So the point that I am making is that legal feminism has nuanced the argument about what does it mean for women to have equality in law. So the criticisms that are, or the kind of critique that is happening at various levels, and we need to think about that. So very often, the reason I am saying all this is that very often as law students, we get stuck on the first step of whether the law should be gender specific or gender neutral. So what feminism is doing for us is saying, hang on, what you're calling gender neutral itself is a problem. Alright, so the next question of whether equality for women will mean gender neutral or gender specific, and if gender specific, then what kind of gender specific, is a later question. What they're saying is that the claim that there is gender neutrality in the law, and that is a good thing, itself needs to be examined. Are you with me on this point? Okay, so what is the problem with gender neutrality then is the claim that our laws are representing objective standards. Objective standards meaning? No. If it was male standard, then it wouldn't be objective standard. Why? Yeah, I'm agreeing with you, but I'm asking all of us to think, why would you make such an argument? That explicitly we are not saying that it is a male standard, but underneath it is really male standard, and all of us know it. If that was the case, we would be engaging in a very big deception. So we don't think that we are engaging in dishonest ways of thinking. So what is happening? So the first point I want to make is that the contribution of feminist critique of law has been to shake our confidence that what we are dealing with is neutral standards. The second point is that we don't think of it as deception or as kind of something is happening and something else is saying. The ways of doing theory give us the confidence that this is how the reality is. That it's not like we know that the standard is male standard, but we will call it objective standard. No, the point is, how do we manage to justify that this constitutes objective standard? So what does it mean to have objectivity in any kind of knowledge and in legal knowledge becomes a particular concern. We've been talking about it right from the start, but in today's lecture we need to look at it in a very grounded manner, like with examples, with actually illustrating that argument, what makes something a gendered standard. All right. Before I go on into the detail of that, so the main argument of feminism then is that law is gendered and it is not working as well for women. The second criticism, or a kind of criticism that is made of this kind of theorizing about law is that as feminists, you've got yourself entangled in the mainstream game. That is, prestigious academics do theory and you want that prestige, so you also now want to do feminist legal theory, but really you've gone very far away from that. Feminism arose as a movement which was a political movement. That is, it was a movement to change social practices, etc. And now by engaging in these kind of theoretical ideas, you've really forgotten what you were there for. What do you think of that argument? Fair enough? That as feminism, when it arose as a movement, was basically about changing the realities, the everyday living realities of women, to make a difference to their lives, to have political action for social reform, etc. Now doing theory about feminism, that also in the law school where it's a very kind of a rarefied activity, you have forgotten that you were there to make a real difference to people's lives, and you have now sort of bought into the system, and now you, because you are doing theory, you will become a professor and then you'll perpetuate the
Ma'am, because this is something when today we realize that something which is coming from mind. As we started our discussion or class, that the understanding is, or the knowledge is a constructed knowledge. Like our mind is made as such that initially, like when you don't know about Domestic Violence Act, you just accept that it's normal. But when you learn, it is stuck to my mind, and this is very it's kind of very reflexive. I hope you understand. Like
yes.
just slapping, because this I have seen even in police station everywhere, that something is not, some physical thing is happening, no doubt about it, but it's coming from mind, like ignoring or not giving too importance. Your wife's slap is something you can get divorce, like cruelty, even for not making tea. But if something happens from husband side, normal slap, that's fine. So I'm not talking about some physical activity, but that's coming or running from that mentality which have. So I think that's where real change will come only if you are working on the thinking as such.
Okay. Now, can I just pass this on, please?
Ma'am, if we just try and do it on practical grounds, it will just have a persuasive value. Whereas if we have a actual statute which perpetuates the same motto, it will have a greater impact. And it also can be held, and the person can be held liable legally, rather than just having a persuasive value and calling out to the conscience of the people. So that is the main reason why we need to theorize and put it into law.
Okay. Yeah.
I was wanting us to go back to that point which you had made when we were doing lawyer science. And this whole business of that, if you observe, if you get into the realm of practice, if you find out, but you really cannot observe in a vacuum. You can't really observe in a vacuum. You have to have a certain kind of a theoretical perspective from which you would observe. So the way I would see it somewhere is to say that feminists are getting involved, by getting involved into theory, are going into privileged activity, is not recognizing the fact that you can't really alter practice unless and until you have a theoretical sort of lens or prism through which you are going to be observing the practice which you want to set right. So that would be my answer to how we need to look at this theory practice.
All right. Do you get the distinction? So there is one argument that laws have to change. There's another argument that is being made, and that's what I'm trying to address right at the beginning, is that laws have to be changed. Like we can say this is wrong and change it, etc. But how do we think about the law is, if you like, a one level back activity. That is, if we change the law on domestic violence, have we changed very much? Okay, think very carefully. So what is happening is that we have now said domestic violence is a harm, which we hadn't said before. But the point is that what is it about law that you have changed? You have said that we have identified the law not giving, say, the protection or space to women in the private sphere, and that's why we want to make this domestic violence law and protect women or give the legal protection in an area that wasn't available before. Now, if you go back to yesterday's, those of you who were here yesterday, if you go back to yesterday's lecture, we had said that public and private distinction is one of the ways that liberal thought operates. That is, it justifies that private sphere is the sphere of freedom, that law should not intervene there. So how would you justify a domestic violence law? Where does domestic violence happen? Why do we call it domestic violence and don't cover it under violence or assault that is applicable to everyone? Do you see the point that I'm trying to make? That if we were not subscribing to the public and private distinction, then we wouldn't need to make a law for domestic violence. We only need to make that law because we are still subscribing to this public-private sphere, and now we are making a literal exception in the private sphere and saying, look, we are so good, we will let you have this protection. We are really about equality. So what feminist legal theory as against changing the law on domestic violence will do is, it will ask you to first go and examine the premises on which you are building your theory. Okay, it's not a trivial point, because the example of domestic violence is a particularly good example because of course it is needed. Who would argue that, having acknowledged that domestic violence happens, that we shouldn't respond? No, 50 years ago that was a serious argument, that leave that area alone. But now we have come to, if you like, some kind of a social understanding that this is a reprehensible activity and the law needs to respond. But we haven't done anything about the fact that violence is now being divided into two kinds of violence: ordinary violence and domestic violence. Do you see the point? By even naming an activity as domestic violence, we are validating the idea that in personal relationships, it is sometimes all right, the point that you were making, that we don't see it as a problem, that the husband, when he hits the wife, so it's not every kind of violence that will be caught in our definition, but we are implicitly validating the notion that mores of conduct in private are different than in public. So this is the point that feminists are making, that your theoretical ideas have to be examined for us to even make sense of our world. So the point they are making is theory practice division is not a valid division. First point. Second point they are making is that theory is transformative, and that's the point you were making, that how we think, how we make sense of our world has very tangible consequences. So we need to then start acknowledging that the kind of theory we do is actually reflecting our value system. So if we keep replicating the public-private divide, then what we are saying is that yes, it is a valid conception that private sphere has to be treated as a sphere of no regulation. We'll sometimes make exceptions to that. Or you could be thinking of that maybe my categorization of public and private division is itself that needs changing. If you do that and then you propose a theory of violence or domestic violence, etc., you will have a different set of assumptions, a different outcome. So if you have this lingering doubt that theory doesn't matter, then what feminist literature is saying is, no, to change society, you need to think differently. So your categories of thought have to change, how you theorize has to change, and they are also making a more ordinary point, if you like, that theory and political action are not separate things. So your political action is necessary, but political action is, as Amita said before, is informed by our first deciding a theoretical position that violence is a problem. So you recognize that this taking this value preference is what leads you to then talking about what kind of action is needed. Now, if I think that violence in personal relationships is a problem, do I necessarily have to go and agitate on the streets like that is political action? Or can I sit in a classroom or sit in my office and write about that this is not the right way to think about domestic violence? Is one political action and the other not? So if you think of political action as social action or as social change, then that happens not only by agitating and holding flags, it also happens by the kind of writing we do, the kind of theorizing we do, and this is the point that is being made. You were going to say something?
Just to repeat what you are saying, or just to make me understand exactly what is, it's just like if we are treating a particular violence, it's just like we are treating one offshoot of that particular thinking. So if we are treating that particular or the genesis of that particular problem, then again we are by this we are treating the like all offshoots of that particular or problem which particular or women are facing as such. Is this the point? Like
yes, but not only women are facing. So that's the other point. That is, women are facing a problem is not happening in abstract. It is happening to a large extent by how we think about it. So is it a woman's problem or is it our problem? So it's a little bit like the title of your book that I have prescribed for you. Does anyone remember the title?
Asking law questions.
Asking the law question. Have you heard also of a very famous sort of a phrase in legal and other literature, the woman question? No? Nobody has heard? It's not a generational thing, I don't think so. Simone de Beauvoir had this very famous set of books in which she is saying, asking the woman question. That is, men are forever saying, I do not understand women. That we have to actually unravel, analyze, try to understand how women think. Okay, take my word for it that there is a lot of writing of that genre. But there is nothing out there which says we have to understand the man question. So what Davis is doing is she's actually playing on that phrase of asking the woman question, and she's saying, let's ask the law question. So the point that she is making by that that phrase is that we only ask that question of somebody else, not of ourselves. So we are so used to that mainstream thinking is the proper way of thinking and women don't fit in. So we ask the woman question. Go and Google it and you'll see how much is there on this point. But the point of Davis's title is that she is making fun of that and saying, we are going to ask the law question because we don't understand what law is about. So again, bringing into focus that our theorizing happens from perspectives, but we take it that our perspective is the perspective. It's not like I and you can think differently. No, there's only one way of thinking properly, and this is the way we do it. She's using it in the context of law, and all these lectures she's basically made the point that when it is claimed that law is objective, ask how is it objective, what is being claimed, can it be established, and this becomes a real sort of testing ground in legal feminism that they are saying your neutral law doesn't hold true for me. So with regard to maternity leave, what do we say? There's a fundamental difference between men and women in this case, so we'll give them, what will we give them, equality or special rights? Okay, do you get the point? So what is equality? Okay, in your labor law, there are certain certain working conditions that all workers are entitled to. What are they? That you're sick, you have a sick leave, you have medical insurance, etc. Do you have any provision for when your child is sick that you can take time off? We are beginning to go there a little bit, but we are quite reluctant to do that. Why? Yeah, and so not only in in organized sector of labor force, how many companies provide working conditions where creche is for children is or for babies is a standard work environment? If a woman needs to work and she's also breastfeeding, is it possible? Started. Okay. We are in 2016 and we are saying it has started. And then also it's very, very, think about the unorganized sector of work. What are the conditions for women workers there? Who gets to look after their children while they have to earn a living? Another related point, we say that if women are having children, do they really need to work? I mean, go to work if you have to go to work, that you need to work, but what is the implied idea? Otherwise, stay home. Why is that not set for male workers? Don't they have children? Not gestation, looking after. Can they do it or not? So the point I'm trying to make is we live in a society where it is taken for granted that bringing up children is women's job. All right, that is the society. What about legal assumptions? Legal assumptions are feeding on social assumptions. So for us to be able to say that you have legal equality, because we don't care whether you are a man or a woman, we have workers' rights. Do you get the point that your worker is imagined to be a male worker who has a wife who will be able to take care of the children, but we don't need to say that. So this is the point that is being made by feminist theory, that your so-called neutral standards are actually reflecting the requirements and the lived experiences of a male worker, but we call it the neutral standard, and by reference to that neutral standard, what women needs then becomes a special requirement. And in liberal understanding, there is equality and then there is special rights. Special rights always, the term special rights always carries with it this notion of largesse. That is, you're not really entitled to it, but we'll be very nice to you and give it to you. Think very carefully. If you were not to call that special rights, what would you call it? Okay, let me talk about reservations. That's not about women, but it captures the point. You want to say that certain sections of society have been treated unfairly to make that right, we will make certain reservations so people can come up to the level playing field. Is that a matter of right? Or is the argument that you're less qualified, you're not up to the standard, but we let you in because we are so good that we make reservations for you? Not only that the system doesn't change, but also you're creating this very big, if you like, myth that we are actually doing something to bring you up to the line, plus the myth that everyone else who's now denied their right is being wronged. That is the argument against reservations is that though if reservations weren't there, I would have got it. The fact that I didn't get it because somebody else got it unfairly means that I am denied equality. Where is that idea coming from? Is the liberal idea of equality, that all of us are legal subjects, equal to start off with, and your social conditions, your what is happening to you actually in society is none of the business of the law. So this is what feminists are saying, that socially we are constructed as men and women. Socially we are different. But then the law pretends that, says come to us, but come to us, don't tell us what your social condition is. If that is your starting position, the law has to be discriminatory. The law has to be disadvantageous to women because it is denying their lived experiences. It is replicating the lived experiences of men but calling it a neutral standard. Unless we grapple with this idea, everything else that feminists are saying will not make sense. So does anyone have a problem with this understanding? I don't want you to feel intimidated that you can't say what you are thinking, because that's the point of discussing it in classes, that we are free to think through our positions. Does anyone have anything to say up till now? No?
If you're saying that, all right, the standard which exists is put out as a neutral standard, but evidently as we have worked out till now by our looking at positivism, looking at the whole business of drawing from law as a science, looking at critical legal studies, looking at realism, that neutrality as such doesn't really exist. I mean, that's one kind of a thing. All right, we're saying that we put it out as neutral, but in fact it was a male dominant, male centric standard which was presented as a neutral standard. That's a point. My query somewhere would be that, okay, then now what happens? If we recognize the fact that, all right, women have been kept out, and then of course, because when we come to your feminisms, it would be also like women and, you know, caste, or women of with disability, women plus, all of that would come. So what do we do?
All right, I'll ask all of you.
Well, it's a very fun, it's like, all right, we made that critique. What do we do? How do we get women in? And which women do we get in? And then what about the fact of, if it is a male standard, that would be my other question, does it encompass all men? Or is it some kind of men? And if it doesn't encompass all men, but what about those men? So when you speak about gender, are you speaking about only women or both?
All right. Okay, I would like all of you to answer, and then I'll come back.
Ma'am, on the second question, point which ma'am made, is just like all men standard or but so when we look, we take example, when we take example, say taking example of women uh, coming in army. It's coming in army, and they are coming. And they are expected to, and they are again coming and proving themselves that they can do almost the same which or work as men do. But there will be always difference, not because of like some biological difference that they cannot do say bench press in a way how men will be doing or things of that sort. So when we are comparing it for both men and women at in a certain area. So that's where we are saying excluding other men, special category or the group of men, group of women, and then they are brought in a level playing field. So that's where, like, I think. And second is I don't know how to put it, but
Try.
no, I'll come back to you
Okay.
after.
That's all right. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
So a little while ago, a year ago, I had did a project on, like not a year ago, a semester ago. So a project on the situation of transgenders in Nepal. I come from Nepal. So so initially what happened, the judiciary in one of the judgments granted there should be equal citizenship rights to transgenders also. They should be issued in the passport and the citizenship card. There should be an option of the third gender. Then after that, in the promulgation of new constitution, to an extent, that view was adopted. But my query in that project was that firstly, that person should accept that, okay, I mean, in this family, I mean, should stand up that, okay, I belong to this third gender. Then the family should be be able to accept that fact, and then the society. But the fact that it is only addressed to the level of law, I don't know the benefit of that would be reaching to the people of that section. So that is where I think, I don't know I'm correct or not, but this was my understanding.
Okay. This is like the point is that there are social mores and then there are legal norms. So what we are dealing with is that if we have identified that there is a problem with the legal norm and we can change it, so who says that there are two genders only? Medically it is accepted that transgender is a identity that people can have. Is it any business of the law then to continue with this fiction that human beings are divided into two genders?
Just to add to that, like even in the Nepalese parliament, we have representation from the third gender society, and that the member of parliament is openly declared that, okay, this is my gender.
Yeah.
But that representation also hasn't, like, I mean, I don't know how much that has benefited to the grassroots level, say in villages and all.
Okay, so let's see that till very recently law had only two genders as legal categories. Now it has acknowledged reluctantly that there can be a transgender identity. All right, now society hasn't accepted it, or large sections of society haven't accepted it. What would you rather do? So there is a disjuncture between law and societal mores. What would you rather do? That the law keep up the fiction of two genders only? Or let there be a disjuncture between social mores and legal mores?
So at least it's a progressive move, like from the point of law at least.
Where do your standards, legal standards come from? If society doesn't want it, should the law be able to incorporate those ideas?
Ma'am, at times we need to go beyond what the society thinks and do actually what is good for the society.
All right. also, I would like you to think very carefully. So, in legal terms, we have this either or way of thinking, that law reflects society, or that societal mores are reflected in law. What is meant by Davis when she says we have to acknowledge that they are mutually constitutive is that we do not stand outside of society, and we do not, law doesn't stand outside of society, but neither does law. Society remain unaffected by law. Do you get my point? So, society is lagging behind, the law wants to do something, it cannot do something in isolation, they are mutually informing each other. And this is what is meant by mutually constitutive. That is the kind of social arrangements I have inform the law, not only the legislation, but how judges behave, how the police behaves, and the rest of it, and how the law behaves in turn makes us change our practices. So, domestic violence, when it was not a crime, meant that as society we had no moral standard that we were compelled to live by. Now, moral standards by definition are something that come from within. If somebody has to impose a standard on me, does that make it a moral standard?
Ma'am, for example, when domestic violence wasn't a law, all you can do is go and approach the husband and say that she's your wife, you have certain responsibility towards her, you're not supposed to do it. Whereas once the law was enforced, you could say that she's a legal entity, she has rights, she has a right for protection, and you can't encroach on her rights. And that could be legally enforceable as well as had a quick and a greater impact. So that is the reason laws should be formed even when the society, a fraction of society doesn't accept it.
All right. So, one point, I think that fraction part I want to focus on, that when we say society is this, society is that, which part of society are we talking about? Do you get the point that this is an argument that we cannot have a hope of substantiating that the society thinks like that? We don't have empirical evidence of that, and we can say that these are the dominant ways of thinking, but dominant ways is different than saying that this is societal expectations. But then if we say that we have to have empirical proof before we put any standards or values in our laws, we are sort of saying we can't do anything. So the point that I am trying to make, and what Davis is making, is societal values and legal values do not exist in watertight compartments, that they are mutually enforcing each other or reinforcing each other, or if you like, reconstituting each other. So the point of feminist reform or their call for reforms was, if I can show you that you're treating women less, giving them less rights just because they happen to be women, in liberal understanding that is not acceptable. Why is that not acceptable? Come on, people. In liberal terms, can you say that women can rationally have lesser rights than men? Married women's right to... That's an important point, because basically, how do you explain that for so long in our legal system, women have been given lesser rights than men, is that the justifications actually have been. So, first point is that liberalism is premised upon this notion of human beings equal by virtue of being equal, but when that idea is translated into legal rights, the history of liberal legalism is that those legal rights, that equality was only available to a very small section of society, and who were they? They were propertied men. That is, we made definitions which said that legal equality applies only if you have certain amount of property. Which means what? women are left out, men without property are left out. And when this idea is extended to colonial, to the colonies, what happens? Were the colonized people treated as equal of the colonizers? But these colonizers were living by liberal values, so they must have had a way of rationalizing, keeping all the colonized people away from their entitlement to legal equality. So if you look at the history of legal equality, it's been gradually extended to wider sections, ever wider sections of society, meaning what? That at every stage we have been able to rationalize the exclusion of certain sections of society from the liberal promise of equality to all human beings. And with regard to women, one of the rationalizations early rationalizations has been that they are not rational and equality is only available to rational human beings. And why are women not rational? They menstruate and they are emotional. So you see the opposite categories that we create in our thinking, that rationality is binary, opposite is emotional. So those who are rational get legal entitlements, those who are not can then be excluded. So why can't married women enter into contracts on their own? You tell me.
I don't know if this is from documentary, some documentary, they were trying to prove that the way women think, scientifically the doctors have proved that there is a difference.
There is a difference, yes. But is that difference rational and emotional, or is it something else? The point I'm trying to make only is that there are differences, how we characterize those differences, and what consequences follow from those differences is the point of the exercise. So by characterizing men and women think differently, you could also say that both of them are equally valid ways of thinking. You have no test which tells you that how men think is rational and how women think is emotional. Second point, not all men think like that, not all women think like that. By definition, you are saying the fact of your biology puts you in that category. The fact of your race puts you in that category that you are less intelligent. These are not natural characteristics, first point. But even if they are relevant differences, what is the relevance of them is decided by us. And this is the point that is being made by legal feminists, that first you use these categories, then you attach meaning to those categories by reference to how men behave. So how men behave becomes rational, how women behave becomes emotional, and really we can only trust rational actors and we cannot trust emotional women. The point that Amita made earlier on, in torts law, for example, damages for life and also for even for emotional shock. That you saw an accident and you then had a nervous breakdown. If there was a duty of care, what kind of damages will be payable? The torts doctrine has developed, which is saying, oh, women react too emotionally. We possibly cannot say that that was a direct result of them witnessing the accident. And the value that you put on a life, if there has been a death in an accident, if a man dies and if a woman dies, what kind of compensation can you get? Man earns a salary, woman only does housework, so how much damages can you ask for that? Do you get the point? That there is nothing inevitable about it. We are the ones who are doing the categorizing, and then we justify unequal consequences in the name of rational thought. So this is the point that is being made by legal feminism, that first you make a distinction between men and women as if it is an, like you don't need to justify that distinction, and then you say men are rational and women aren't and certain consequences follow. All right, we give up that. We are now more intelligent, we know that that is not the case. What kind of a legal system would you end up with? Where women can have exactly the same rights as men. This is also called equality as sameness doctrine. That is, you showed us our ways of classifying men and women were not so sound after all. Men and women can now have the same rights. Fair enough? End of story. Go to the laws of sexual assault. It's only been a recent history that we have changed our understanding of what sexual assault means, what kind of laws we need to capture the wrong that has been done. All right, we have changed the laws. Have we changed anything in society? I have a short life. You might have more time than I do. Do you think I'll see that change in my lifetime? What else needs doing for me to convince you that there's something seriously wrong here? Why do I have to wait another 10 years or 20 years for things to gradually change? Go.
We can improve our technology overnight, but non-material aspects, just our morals, our thinking, traditions take a long time to change. So that is a thing we need to accept and acknowledge.
All right. You wanted to say something?
Satyendra was telling us that science has now established that men and women, or at least there is a male and a female way of thinking. Or maybe there is, actually science has also established that it's a longer continuum and there are like very diverse ways of thinking. The question then I would have is that if you are asking us that all right, women are getting the same as men, so is that fine? But then if women are getting the same as men, or the female and the male way of thinking is all being treated as the male way of thinking, then in effect, what are you doing? You are killing off a whole range of people and saying you become the same as the other. What kind of equality is this?
Yeah, so for women to be getting equality is that they should act like men, they should think like men, they should behave like men. Is that the kind of equality you are asking for? So the point being that are men and women different? If they are different, what would legal equality look like? So initially, liberal legal equality was that women have been denied certain rights, we'll now give you the same rights as men. The second step is to say, but why do I have to act like a man to get any kind of legal equality? With regard to labor laws, this is one of the things that if you want to progress in your life, if you guys want to go and be lawyers in big law firms, how do you think your career paths will go as men and women? As students, you do equally well. So virtually, men and women law students perform equally well in their law schools. Once they leave the law school, if you trace the career trajectories of law graduates, I don't know the statistics here, but definitely in the West, the trajectory is that within 10 years, the male lawyers have progressed, women lawyers have mostly fallen off the ladder. Why? Because they cannot be a high-flying lawyer and have children at the same time. That is, if you decide to have children, then you, as a professional woman, you have to be prepared to pay the price. Did anyone tell you that you have to have children? You made a choice. Why do you want to blame everyone else for that? What do you think? Is that a fair society?
I also had a counter question from the other side, that to be saying that all right, fine, if I am, if we are saying that all right, there is a male and a female way of thinking, not that men and women think that ways, then what about the fact of that a man who doesn't think the male way, is there any kind of option open to him? Is that equality, that you're going to treat, there is a certain kind of an archetype you create, and you say now all men have to behave like that.
Yeah. So even with that,
So it is like I'm quite happy being at home looking after the babies and writing my storybook, or painting or cooking, whatever is that. I am a homemaker. I enjoy it. I enjoy it because it's a part of my personality. How much of the way in which we construct, both social mores as well as the legal ones, what level of opportunity?
Yeah.
For me, it's like the equality sameness business operates at several levels. So I want to ask this question from both standpoints. Ask that question from the standpoint of the woman getting treated as the man, and the man getting treated as the archetypal man.
Yes. So basically what we're getting at is just to bring back the discussion to show you that we're not talking about only social mores, we are also talking about how they get reflected in the law. So think about it, you are an employee and you have you are an employer and you have two employees, a man and a woman of same age. Both of them decide to have children with different partners. How will it pan out in their career projection? The fact that the man has also a child makes no difference to how he progresses. The fact that a woman has a child basically means that she has to step down from her career path for the time being at least. Now this is not a legal imposition, this is a social expectation. The law's answer is, you decided, don't blame us. We give everyone the right to be a lawyer, and if you decide not to pursue your career, that's your problem. Amita is saying, now think about it, that the man decides that I'll stay at home, let my wife go and earn. Okay, what is the law's response to that? It's not going to stop the man from doing that. But how will we treat that man? Yes. So the point being that the law can wash his hands off treating both of them badly and say, these are your personal choices, we have nothing to do with it. So the first point is that the connection between law and societal mores has to be taken into account. The second point is that how the law has framed this issue is that you are a worker. We don't care that workers have children or not children. So if you have children and you need to pay a price for that, go and pay a price for that. Now, theoretically what Amita is saying is valid, but in practice, most men will opt not to take that option of wanting to be the primary homemaker because of the kind of economic consequences that follow. What economic consequences am I talking about? That generally speaking, even now, men earn more than women. So if one of you have to stay at home, it makes economic sense that the one who can bring in more money should go out and work and the other one should stay at home. Do you get the point that where is the choice of we both making this considered choice that children need looking after? What is rational in this? Rational behavior is that we need money. Whoever earns more money should go out and work. The other person should look after the children. Possible to say that? Okay, why don't we manage that? Is because legal mores and social mores interact all the time. So we cannot say that here is a law, perfect law available to you. Take maternity leave, take paternity leave, whatever you want to do. We are not bothered. But how many people take paternity leave? Yes, you won't get the same amount, the same length, etc. Yeah.
What has been reported, at least in some sociological studies, and it's worth looking at, is what they are reporting is this, that the man may take the leave,
But the woman does the work.
but the woman does both work. She's doing the work at home and outside. He's taking the leave, but he's not really pulling his weight in relation to. So consequently then a number of women have petitioned that it's better to have a longer maternity leave and stay if the social stereotype is going that route. But the point I'm somewhere trying to make, that the point you were making earlier, that the law doesn't prevent you, is not really correct, because the system of entitlements that we put in place are very much in accord with. Say you talk in terms of flexi timings. You say you can work from home. You say you can go part-time. You look at the various socioeconomic studies which have emerged from there. Who is taking it? Who is taking it? Who is the one who's taking it in pay? Who's the one who's operating from home? Who's the one then who consider the lesser, non-serious worker?
So do you see the point that everything is connecting to create a situation where women as a group earn less than men? But even don't go that far. Think of your chosen profession. Women lawyers earn much less than men lawyers. If you are equally competent, which nobody has any doubt about, you do equally well in law schools, when you start going out, these are not choices that you are making. This is constrained choices. These are not free choices. And the constraint is happening by the law not recognizing or not naming the social reality. So what is the primary social reality we are dealing with regard to industrial laws is basically that to be a worker, to be an ideal worker, you need to be reliable. That you will turn up for work every day, you will not take too many days off, that you will not be late, that you will not need to leave early, you will not want flexi time all the time, you will not be taking months and months off to bring up children, etc. Nobody says that women have to do it. But the point is that by not naming it as a reality, as a social reality, the law is saying you're free to make your choices. We have done what we wanted to do, like we have done that, we have given you same rights. After that, how the social realities happen and how you make your choices is not the business of law. So the point that is being made here is that when you're dealing with legal feminism, at one level you're dealing with what are the specific rights that the law gives you. And in today's time, there's precious little where you can say that the law actually gives you lesser rights than men just because of you being a woman. But it has not translated into us creating a society where men and women are situated equally. If they are now not situated equally, where does the problem lie? The lawyer's response, or the liberal lawyer's response, was nothing to do with us. We had a problem, we have fixed it. We have given you the same rights, now go and make the best use of the opportunities you have. Later liberal, legal feminist analysis are basically saying, no, you cannot treat law as if it cannot take into account the existing social hierarchies. Basically, that we live in a gender hierarchy society. We do not live in a society where men and women are placed equally in social and economic terms. If that is the society and we don't reflect it in the law, what do you want to change? Who do you want to put the blame on? Okay, you are lawyers, you tell me. Law has done its job. Don't ask me to do anything more. You try to convince me otherwise.
Ma'am, we understand that law is something which reflects society, because a signboard, and we have to follow certain thing, the normative order, and if it is not followed, that's where you break rule or law. So, but now when we have assigned so much of power, or we have given away our consent, that law is ruling us. So now it's the duty of law to make changes in itself in such a way that society is changing and in a good way. So that's where I'll
Okay, what is law? How will this law change itself? How will it do the right thing? What is this law that we're talking about? It is an entity, it is a person, it is a institution that we can go to and say that, look, this needs changing?
At two levels, ma'am. One is because if you get hurt, is something which you have to apply medicine, conservatives. But the again thing is how actually it happened. So both at thinking level and also while doing actions.
All right.
So
Which actions will we take? Thinking we can leave for the timing. What actions can you suggest that we can take to change the current situation where we have formal legal equality, we do not have actual legal equality or substantive legal equality? Are you with me on those terms? You understand the difference between formal legal equality and substantive legal equality? It's like saying that there is nothing in industrial laws that prevents men and women from working or being applying for a job. But the result is that we live in a society where high paid jobs are generally lesser women than men. So substantive equality doesn't exist. Has law got to do anything with this state of affairs?
Just to extend my argument, so men are meant to, they can work for longer hours. So what law can do is the same thing. They can extend the working hour for women by ensuring that there is equal opportunity, or there is no harassment as such.
So
Something
how will we
which
do that?
She said in earlier classes.
All right, how would we do that? I'm giving you a real life scenario. You're going to be out working as lawyers tomorrow. Tell me, how do you imagine your careers will go? You've all decided to join law firms.
Not all.
Okay, hypothetical. You've all decided to join law firms. How do you think, where will you be in 5 years' time? Try to imagine. You've been invited by a big law firm to join them. 5 years' time, what will you be doing? Will you be a junior still, or would you be going towards being a somewhat middle management and then senior management? Don't tell me you have no idea what you will be doing.
Partner.
Good, you're getting there. Okay, but Yeah, but what about women amongst the group? Would you care to have children? Okay, not only women. Would you, all of you, imagine that you'll have families, that you'll have partners, and that you'll have children? Yeah? How will that affect your career trajectory? Think through. Don't just imagine. Don't just sit there like it's not something to do with me. It's very much to do with you. So as a man, think about that. When you have a partner and you have a child, how will that affect your career trajectory? Not much.
Slightly different.
Slightly different.
No.
No, wait.
Slightly different. What I am going to say. Not.
No, I don't want you to destroy my example, so I'll let you wait. Tell me, what do you think will happen?
So I think what you're trying to get at is
No, I'm not trying to get that. I want you to be honest with yourselves and tell me, how do you think having children would affect you if you're a man or if you're a woman?
yeah.
Do
So
you
as a man, I would think that if I have a child, then I'll have a little bit of risk. Okay, I might not take, I might not be, confident enough to take risk in my professional, career. But as a woman, the risk would be much more, I think, higher in terms of having a child. I mean, that's it. Like, I'm just saying it. This is,
Yeah, I understand, yeah.
Ma'am, what basically according to me, there are just two type of people: one that are emotional and that are practical. If I'm a practical woman, then I'll be looked down upon.
Tell
like
me
you are not.
which kind are you?
I don't know. I haven't.
All right, I think exactly that's what I wanted to hear, that as a woman, it's up to me.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and similarly, if I'm a man who's very emotional, again I'll be looked down upon.
Yeah.
Like stop. There is a. I don't like to use the sentence, but it's the saying that stop behaving like a woman
That's
or stop
right.
behaving like a girl.
That's what Amita was saying, that you would be so
And-
what can I say, so negatively characterized.
Yeah, and ma'am, again, if I am a man and I want to spend some time with my child, I won't be allowed because there is no paternity leave.
Mm.
So again, that is a problem which I would, as a person, face if I don't match the social stereotyping that has been taken place in the society. So no matter whether I'm a man or woman, those stereotypes are going to affect me.
Good. So that is the point. First, that stereotypes exist, and second, that it's not only like I'm not absolutely free to disregard them. Okay, so if as a man I want to be a homemaker, I have to put up with a lot of social opprobrium. If as a woman I want to be a professional and I decide I'm practical and not emotional, then I will be a successful lawyer. Can you imagine the social opprobrium that will be heaped upon you for being selfish, for acting like a man, and the rest of it? So social stereotyping happens on both sides, but the point is, between men and women, social stereotyping sort of leans on the side of that men earn more than women, that financially they are in a stronger position than men, and basically the economic dependence then compounds the issue that women are associated with family, women are associated with being caregivers, and the rest of it. Now give me 1 minute and I'll come to you in a minute. Now think about it. What have labor laws got to do with it? What have labor laws got to do with it? Anything? Nothing. Yeah? Sure? Sure? Can you imagine another kind of a labor law regime which is basically, so what I'm getting at is that anybody who has the primary caregiving responsibilities becomes economically dependent. In our society, that happens to be mostly women. Can you imagine a labor law which says all workers have children, all workers have to take time off, that whenever there is a child, each parent will have to share the responsibility. Amita's point, but that doesn't work because men take the paternity leave and women go out to work and then come home and do the domestic chores. So what's the way out? Could you imagine saying that we will make a law that whenever there is a child, anything that is earned is going into both partners' names in half and half amounts? That your salary doesn't only go in your bank account, but half of it goes in your account, half of it goes into the wife's account and whoever's taking care of the child. Can you imagine? It's beyond our imagination. Why? Because it is interfering in an economic sphere that is not the business of the law. Do you see how we are connecting the dots? So we live in a patriarchal system, we have an industrial law, we have a philosophy of free economic sphere of activity. All of them come together to make it look like it is your personal choice and the legal system has nothing to do with it. So this is the point that Margaret Davis is making, that it is not only the specific laws that you have to look at it, you have to look at how the social and the legal and the institutions come together to create this notion, the doctrine of public and private. What does that mean? Basically, it means that what happens in the private is not regulated by law, but in private is also not only your personal relationships, it's also your market relationships. That is, when you earn something, it's your business how you decide to use it. Who's the law to come and tell you that you have to give half of your property to your wife, half of your salary to your wife? But she's doing more than half the work, maybe we'll give her more than half. If you don't like it, send her out to work, then you can have her half salary. Why not? We are so used to the idea that having children is a personal business. How we look after them is a personal issue. Law does not interfere, but by having a certain kind of industrial law, we are making it look like these are individual choices, free choices that are being made, rather than that it is replicating a social reality that women look after children, men go out and earn, and then suppose the relationship doesn't work out. What will this woman with children walk out with? Promise only, because enforcing maintenance is notoriously difficult and the amount of maintenance that the courts pay is shockingly small. So if you're planning to do that, my gratuitous advice is please don't. The point being that these are things we don't say. Why? Because that's your private business. What I'm suggesting to you is that what is your private business is very much structured by the legal ways of thinking, the legal institutions, and they're not only in the sphere of industrial law, they're spanning out into what kind of banking system you have, what kind of interference can the state have with regard to your salary and the rest of it. Sorry, Amita, I didn't let you.
I suppose just wanted to, because I mean it's stemming from a biographical reality, but I would come to that later. I just wanted to add on an example. Like till now you were talking about marriage and children and who's responsible for. I'm saying all right, fine, in today's times a lot of people do not want to get into the hassle of marriage. You want to live together, you are partners, and it's like it's a publicly acknowledged fact, even as you have a general social mores where you're expected that if you want to be if you want to be interacting together, then you do get married. I'm saying is, supposing you openly live together and you are practicing professionals, and there is this whole business of that, all right, who's doing well and who would get what kind of elevations, will it impact on both in the same way? Because if we are saying that what I do in my private life is my personal affair and hence should not be taken into account anywhere, would it work the same way for the man and the woman?
So give us, elaborate like.
The reason I'm asking this is that, you know, like if those of you who read Raju Ramchandran's, he did this biographical piece on Shyamala Pappu, who just died very recently. And in that biographical piece, he speaks in terms of Shyamala Pappu and her partner living together in like, because that was their belief system. They did not believe in marriage. And Shyamala was like, then she was the first person who was lined up to be, you know, like, because the kind of work that she was doing as senior advocate, it was, she had the requisite practice, and her name came to be suggested to be, I think, the first Solicitor General, first woman Solicitor General. And the only reason why she did not get it is because they were living together.
They were living together.
And they were not married. So I somewhere, it kind of struck me as majorly. So I was just wondering that, okay, that was at a different period in time. Do we expect different consequences? And it's like, or are there morality requirements still from the woman which are different from the man? I mean, that because of the public-private divide coming in, and this intersection between your work life and your personal life, and the choices you make in your personal life, it's not just to do with, it's like, it's something that I believe in, and I'm not being sly about it. I'm not hiding anything. I'm saying so. I'm very, very curious to ask the class as to how would they see it and how would they respond, react to it. And especially because, see, when this happened, when Shyamala did not get the position, there was a lot of murmuring and whispering as, oh my God, this is like too much and they shouldn't have done it, and oh, she's paid the price. These kinds of sentences you heard all over the place. It's only when I read Raju's biographical, you know, his like kind of his tribute to her.
Do you have that anywhere? Like,
Yeah, I have it. I can share it.
Are you interested in reading it?
Because it was like a very telling tribute, you know, that that it suddenly the penny dropped, that in fact what happened, you know. And I thought it was again interesting that when you're being beaten up at home, then the law doesn't intervene. But when you're making a personal choice, because you do not want to, like you feel that the institution of marriage as such is not very equal between men and women, for your professional entitlements, it becomes a relevant fact.
Yeah. And to link it to today's reading, basically what is being said is that by changing specific laws, you don't change a lot unless you start changing the categories that are used by legal thinkers. And public and private divide is a fundamental way of organizing our ideas in liberal legal systems. So this is a very good illustration of that while we subscribe to this separate spheres of public and private, the effects of that categorization are not tangible in the sense that we can say there is a law against it, or we can even propose a law against it. But because it is how the entire legal system operates, that consequences fall differently on men and women, and invariably the consequences work to the detriment of women. So one of the very big arguments in legal feminism is that if things have to change, so what would it make to have less unfair laws, is not only that you target industrial laws and you target maternity leave or you target something else, is you have to start asking how legal thinking is organized. So the fact that the law subscribes to public and private distinction itself has to be challenged, has to be, if not replaced, then at least modified. Now, Think about it very, very carefully for yourselves. Can you imagine that public and private is how your education is also organized? That public and private is the trope, is the dichotomy that is used to organize your legal education also? Or not really? Maybe not at all. Take a position. What do you think? Is this public and private divide have anything to do with how your legal education is organized? How?
And there is free education for women.
Free education
For women. Yeah, so in a way, there are even schools which operate for educating the women of the house. Ma'am, I feel again there is a gender discrimination when it comes to the prioritizing dissemination of education in India. So
because there is free education for
Yeah.
women. Okay, I'll come to that in a minute, but what I had in mind was your legal education. So how your legal curriculum is organized, do you think public and private distinction actually plays out in any of that? Are you familiar with this classification of legal subjects into public law and private law? Yes or no? Come on, tell me yes or no. What is it? What is public law? Administrative, constitutional law. What else? Criminal. Okay, criminal law and what else? Labor law. And what's private law? Anything else? Contracts, torts. So what are we talking about is that we are categories of thinking starting with your legal education are all structured around this public and private, and in every area of law public and private plays out differently, and this is a point that is made by feminist legal scholars, that as long as you don't question what constitutes public and what constitutes private, is there another way of doing things, you are basically going to remain on the surface of saying change this section or change that statute and the rest of it, but how we think at a abstract or at a theoretical level has very real practical consequences. So what is being said is the theoretical categories have very real practical consequences. For we do not have the option of saying that theory is for somebody else to do and I'll deal with the specifics of law. Yeah? Want to say something? No? All right. So has it ever occurred to you why your law subjects are divided into public and private? That's what your teachers told you. That's all right. But can I ask you what might be the rationale for some subjects being called public law and others being called private law? Come on, people, you must have some idea. Why is constitutional public and family, or not family, contracts private?
Because the implications are, I mean, in public law, the implications are in general terms. Say in a contract, it's more of a personal transaction.
All right. So basically, yeah.
Liberalism will be seen as or can be considered as private law, and what isn't can be, because even there we see even if we constitutional law and Sorry, I just forgot like what I wanted to do.
That's all right. So basically what I'm getting at by asking this question is that why are certain subjects called public law and other called private law is basically by this liberal idea that when there is a relationship between the individual and the state, that is a public matter. When it is a relationship between two individuals or two citizens, then it is a private matter. So contracts is basically that's what you're getting at. It is between two individuals. Torts is that if there is a injury of some kind, it's between two individuals. When it is between the state and the individual, you have something like criminal law. Now that's all right. That's one way of organizing the world. But then we go on and attribute importance or significance to public law as the real law and private law as the soft law subjects. And that happens even more when you start talking about things like family law. So when you think about careers and when you think about joining big law firms, if you think like that, which kinds of law firms do you decide to join? Would you like to join? Do you get the point that I'm trying to hint at? That big money is with commercial law firms. It is not with soft law like family law or law and sexuality or health law or the rest of it. Where is big money is what is considered significant law. What is that? That is mostly commercial law firms. Think about it very carefully. The categorization of your subjects is happening by reference to these concepts of public and private, and yet it is made to look like it is so inevitable, it is so natural that nothing needs to be questioned. So one of the functions of liberal legal theory is to sensitize us to how it is that categories of analysis make it look like that this is the only way of thinking. So their argument is that if we become alert to that there is nothing natural about dividing the world into public and private and then attaching different consequences to public and separate consequences to private, then at least an opening happens for us. Try to imagine what would the universe look like if family law wasn't the way it is. Earlier Amita made a point that a lot of young professionals, you don't feel the need to get married. You're living together, you make a life together, you earn enough, both of you, you have children, God forbid, but the relationship finishes. What will you walk out with from that relationship? Try to imagine. I'm seriously saying that I hope it doesn't happen to any of you, but the possibility exists. Are you prepared for it? So it's not even a subject of family law, right? So what family law does, it has its own set of problems. But tell me, how do you imagine your personal affairs will be sorted out if you live together for 10 years, have 2 children, but now the relationship has ended? What are your legal remedies? Did you have a joint bank account? You did? That's what I'm saying. No, the point that I'm trying to make is that the social expectations are that in romantic situations you don't talk about money. If you start talking about money right at the beginning, I'll live with you if you have a joint bank account, the other person will say, maybe I don't really want to live with you. Okay, the point being that our categories of organizing are that romantic is different than economic. But think about it very, very carefully. Living together is a desirable situation, is a romantic situation, but is it also an economic relationship? Is it or is it not? How can it be any other way? But in legal terms, we say that is a personal decision, that is not an economic relationship. Do you get the point that the law is perpetuating a situation where it is basically denying that relationships involve mutuality, they also involve economic dependence, and that has to be provided for. Okay, forget about this somewhat radical example. Suppose you were more conventional and you decided to get married and the marriage ends in 10 years. Now what are your legal rights? Okay, you are a Hindu couple. What are your property rights here?
Alimony, maintenance for the children, then a different bank account for children and their future for studies, and if we had a prenup, then accordingly.
If you had a prenup,
Yeah.
suppose you did not have. What is your legal entitlement? If lawyers don't know this, how do you think other people know anything about what your legal entitlements are after a relationship ends? I mean, either you don't know or you're pretending you don't know, but what I'm trying to get at is that family law basically is there for the eventuality that a relationship ends. But when a relationship ends, Hindu law, which is supposed to be reformed law and the rest of it, basically gives the woman nothing except the promise of maintenance. No share in property. You could have been a high-flying professional. You could have been earning more than the husband. None of it matters. Do you call it equality? What would be the solution? The standard liberal solution is, okay, we'll make sure that both of them get equal property. But is that really a solution that you're looking for? Or should the solution be that family law's business is not to make it possible that anyone becomes economically dependent? Right from the beginning of a relationship, whether marriage or otherwise, you pool your resources. Both of you have to earn a living. Both of you have to equally look after children so that you take the consequences of that responsibility. Can you imagine a law like that?
And that's not possible. I mean, because it's encroaching on your personal choice.
Exactly. I was hoping you'll say that. Thank you. And this is precisely the point I'm trying to make, that if we try to make laws like that, there will be absolute hue and cry that this is draconian, this is taking over my personal life. This is what feminists are saying, that unless you give up this subscription to public and private, we will justify social inequalities in the name of legal equality. Do you think you are willing to take that on board? Do you study any of this in your family law? Why not? Why not? This is the point that was made yesterday, that textbook tradition defines for us what constitutes knowledge in any given area. So the law doesn't concern itself with consequences of disassociating social and legal assumptions, and it doesn't concern itself with what are the conditions in which choices will be made. It doesn't concern itself with that the judges who will sit there and decide your case are also part of the system where these ideas are considered to be private concern rather than the concern of the wider society or the wider legal system. Do you not see the point that is being made, that it is so interconnected that changing a law here and changing a law there is not going to change anything? So one of the things that Davis is mentioning on page 219, if you want to write that down, I want you to read the last paragraph on page 219. You can read it later, but please mark it. Page 219, last paragraph, it goes on to the next, so 220 also. Do we want to have a break? Mm-hmm.